Mr. Watson here, and in this video we're going to be talking about muscles. Now this video might end up being lengthy, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth, specifically of the muscles' main actions, and I've tried my best to unpack the mark schemes from all the previous movement analysis questions and try to provide basically more than just the antagonistic pair. Just to give you more options for your answers in the exam, depending if it's a specific physical exercise or joint movement, because they can get complicated as we go on to add muscle contractions, etc. So, and it's also important for your knowledge to know that muscles are responsible for more than one movement and at more than one joint. Okay, so I'll do my best to explain it to you. As always, pause, fast forward, rewind as you need. We'll start off with the major skeletal muscles, and I'm just going to quickly flick through these because, as I've said, we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So we have the axial muscles, which are the rectus abdominis and the external obliques. Now we have others that you can't see, which we'll go on to a little bit later. We have the deltoids, we have anterior, middle and posterior. We've got the pectoralis major, biceps brachii, wrist flexors, the hip flexors, the iliopsoas, the sartorius, that's thin strip running down the quadriceps there. We have the tibialis anterior, and the biggest change from GCSE, the quadriceps group, which quad meaning four. We have four muscles: rectus femoris, vastus intermedius, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis. From the posterior side, we have the trapezius, the infraspinatus, which is one of the four rotator cuffs we need to know, triceps brachii, latissimus dorsi, wrist extensors, gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, the hamstrings group, which becomes three, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. Now I do want to emphasize here, there are movement analysis questions such as flexion of the knee, for example, hamstrings. You won't get the mark for writing hamstrings. You need to write them three muscles right there, just to emphasize that point. Same with the quadriceps. Gastrocnemius and the soleus. Now we do need to know more muscles than that, such as the other three rotator cuffs and others, but we're going to go into this more detail now, and as I've mentioned, I'm going to add more muscles but try to highlight which is the main muscle responsible. So here we go. We're starting with the shoulder. It's going to be the longest joint we talk about, as there are a lot more movements, but we'll start with flexion of the shoulder, and the primary muscles are the anterior deltoid, the front deltoid, and the pectoralis major. So there you are, you have the anterior deltoid and the pectoralis major. Now we do have some secondary muscles involvement here, being the biceps brachii. Okay, but a little bit less involved, main being the anterior deltoid. Okay, shoulder extension. We have the posterior deltoid. Now I've highlighted that one to show the antagonistic pair with the anterior, but the latissimus dorsi can also be pretty much the main one there. They are both primary, and depending on what you're doing, how much they'll be used. So there's your posterior deltoid, and as we've seen from what I've just done, there's the latissimus dorsi. Okay, secondary muscles here we have two, one being the triceps brachii, which you could have guessed, and the pectoralis major plays a secondary role in some shoulder extension. Moving on to horizontal flexion, and the exact same as flexion, primary anterior deltoid and pectoralis major, which are right there, secondary biceps brachii. Okay, so same muscles involved as shoulder flexion. However, horizontal extension is a little different. The primary muscles are the posterior deltoid, okay, which is similar to shoulder extension, but we have the infraspinatus, our first rotator cuff that we need to know, and one of the four. So there's the posterior deltoid. There's the rather large rotator cuff, or larger than the others, I should say, the infraspinatus. And then we have the latissimus dorsi, which plays a secondary roll. Moving on to shoulder adduction, and sorry, I'm not explaining this, but you can watch my previous video away from the midline. Hopefully the movements are playing in your head right now and you're nice and comfortable. Primary muscles here, pectoralis major and latissimus dorsi. Okay, there's the pectoralis major. You'll see the latissimus dorsi on the posterior view. Secondary muscles here are the deltoid, specifically the anterior and posterior, not the middle. And the reason it's not the middle is because that's the primary mover of abduction. Now the supraspinatus, which is our second rotator cuff we need to know, is also a primary mover. But if you are asked about which muscle is responsible for abduction of the shoulder, your first answer should be middle deltoid. Middle deltoid, I've tried to show you there, that what gives it its rounded shape. And the supraspinatus is above the infraspinatus. It's that rotator cuff right there. Latissimus dorsi, I'll just label from the primary muscle in adduction. And the pectoralis major is involved again in a secondary role in abduction, but it also played a secondary role in horizontal extension. And as we know, horizontal extension can also be called horizontal abduction. So no surprises there to see the pectoralis major involved a lot. Okay, elevation and depression I'm going to keep fairly simple and put straight up. Your primary muscle for both is the trapezius. Okay, and that is the triangular shaped muscle on the back there. So the trapezius is primary muscle for elevation and depression. So let's take a look at the rotator cuffs, and these are going to be involved in our rotation, hence the name rotator cuffs. So starting with medial rotation, rotating towards the midline, the humerus on its own axis. The subscapularis is the primary muscle, so this rotator cuff is primary for this. Now, just to mention, while you're not going to be asked to label this, you do need to know what their primary movement is, and the subscapularis is for medial rotation, with the secondary muscles being the pectoralis major, but I'm not going to label that as we've seen it quite a lot. Lateral rotation, we have the other two. Now, infraspinatus we've seen before, but the teres minor we haven't. It's just below. Okay, right there. And as you'll see, the one that's missing on here is the supraspinatus, which is above the infraspinatus, okay, but it's not involved in the rotation. Okay, secondary muscles here would be the posterior deltoid, meaning the back deltoid, which we've seen already. So they are your rotator cuffs. Please get familiar with the movements they're involved in. Okay. Right, onto the vertebral column. And as we know, vertebral column, gliding joint, multi-axial, just severely restricted. But we are going to have a few more movements to cover here, but I'm going to try to put them on one side because the same muscles are involved. So starting with flexion of the spine, flexion of the vertebral column, the rectus abdominis, the abs. Okay, so that top layer there, they are your primary muscle for vertebral column flexion. Now the secondary muscles are going to be, I'll put transversus abdominis on there because we need to know, and it's pretty much involved in a lot because it stabilizes your core. It's like wearing a inner weightlifting belt, okay? Keeps the structure nice and stabilized. But our secondary muscles are actually the internal and external obliques. And it's almost like you've got three layers there. The external on that, and deeper than that is internal, and deeper than that is the transversus abdominis. But they play a secondary role in vertebral column flexion. Now, before we go to extension, the opposite movement, I'm going to show you what the internal and external obliques are primary muscles for. One is lateral flexion, okay? If you remember that bending to the side, okay? The external and internal obliques are primarily responsible for that. And the secondary is the erector spinae. Now, you won't see that yet until we get to the posterior and the muscles on the back, but you will shortly, as we still have one more, rotation. And the primary muscles are the external and internal obliques. Okay, and the erector spinae is a secondary muscle. So they are working during that. And let's see what the erector spinae is. Now, it's the primary muscle for vertebral column extension, the opposite movement to our flexion. And we'll see that here. Now, I've labelled it simply, the erector spinae is a group, basically. But I just labelled it fairly simple, okay? But that is the primary muscle for extension of the vertebral column. So it's an antagonistic pair with the rectus abdominis. The secondary muscle here is the multifidus, which we need to know, but it plays a secondary role. Now, ideally, you'd always write erector spinae there, but if you were specifically asked in an exam question, what is the role of the multifidus, and it's involved in spinal extension, vertebral column extension, I should say. Okay, the elbow, a simple one. We should know this already from GCSE. So elbow flexion, biceps brachii, decreasing the joint angle, etc., etc. But I am going to add in another one for us. So here's the biceps brachii, the dual head there, bi meaning two, long and short. We're going to introduce you to the brachialis. Now, while that's not on our syllabus, I will use it in a later video on agonist, antagonist, and synergist. It's a helper muscle. So I've put it in there as a secondary. Okay. And then we've got extension, so triceps brachii, and we don't need to know any of their secondary. So nice simple one for us there. Staying simple, radio ulnar, so we should know pronation and supination is coming up, but which muscles are responsible? So pronation, we have the pronator teres, and that is that long strip of muscle there, so for turning the palm face down. And biceps brachii will also work as a secondary muscle there. And then we have supination, okay, the supinator, and it would have been nice here, but just stuck with the pronator, but pronator teres, and that is the other muscle there, and supinator for turning the palm face up. All right, onto the wrist. Okay, so biaxial joint, so we've got more movements. But let's start with flexion. Now, the muscles here I've labelled simply, and trust me, they're way more complicated than this, but it's not details we need to worry about. And we'll not worry about it, and we'll keep it simple. And wrist flexors, wrist flexion, nice and easy. So on the forearm there are our wrist flexors. Extension, wrist extensors. And on the back of the arm, you'll find our wrist extensors. So they are your primary muscles for wrist flexion and wrist extension. So hopefully you'll remember that as soon as we move off this slide. Okay, moving on to the hip. So our other ball and socket, we're obviously going to have a lot of muscles involved here. I'll try to give you the primary ones, the main ones, but allow you, again, like I mentioned before, other muscles that have been accepted by Cambridge because they are involved in the movement. Here, starting with hip flexion, so moving the femur forward, the main one is the hip flexor muscle, the iliopsoas. Okay. We also have the rectus femoris from the quadricep group, which we'll come on to when we get to the knee. And that's also involved here, but the main muscle responsible is the iliopsoas, okay? And there's two, it's a little group, so you have the psoas major and the iliacus, but we just need to know them as the iliopsoas, the hip flexor, okay? So they are your two there, and as you can see, attaching to the vertebral column. So you'll even see the iliopsoas coming up if we're flexing the vertebral column in a sit-up, for example, with the rectus abdominis. But our primary muscles there, iliopsoas and the rectus femoris of the quadriceps. Secondary muscles is the sartorius. If we remember that thin muscle going across our quadricep when I introduced the major skeletal muscles. Okay, sartorius involved in hip flexion. It's a much smaller muscle, more of a synergist, but if you were asked about the sartorius in a specific question, which has come up in the past, it would be hip flexion and knee flexion, which I'll come on to. Okay, I'll put two up here. Extension of the hip and lateral rotation. We have the gluteus maximus. Now, the gluteus maximus, as I've mentioned, is an antagonistic pair of the iliopsoas. Gluteus maximal is hip extension, although the biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, the hamstrings group, just like the rectus femoris helps with flexion, actually all three of the hamstrings help with extension, okay, specifically, and to keep them on there. The biceps femoris itself would also help with lateral rotation, but the reason the three of them are on, because the three of them help with hip extension. So let's take a look. Gluteus maximus, we should know, the big one there. And I'm not putting the hamstrings on because they'll come up later. Now, hip adductor group is simple if you keep it simple. We have three adductor muscles and the gracilis, and they're all involved in hip adduction. So we have adductor longus, longus meaning long, adductor brevis, short, and adductor magnus, the biggest, okay, largest. And then we have the gracilis, and they are our primary muscles for adduction. So if you get asked about hip adduction, you can put any of them, okay? And adductor right at the start should be a key connection there. Again, not needing to worry about labeling these, but the gracilis is on the inside. But let's start with adductor brevis, moving down adductor longus, and then the wider one there, adductor magnus, the larger one, and then the gracilis, like in your groin area, running down right there. So opposite to that, we have abduction. I've put on medial rotation, okay, so rotating away from the midline. And that's because the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus are responsible for both. Okay, so there we have the gluteus medius, and on the other side the gluteus minimus. It's on a deeper level below the maximus there. Okay, so getting through this now moving on to the knee. As you know, uniaxial hinge joint, flexion and extension. And we have the hamstrings and quadriceps group. Now, while you might see as the subtitle there, we need to know or be writing the muscles correctly for them. So, flexion of the knee is the responsibility of the hamstring group, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. Okay, so here they are labeled right there. Okay, so they are your primary muscles for knee flexion. Secondary muscles would be the gastrocnemius and, as we've mentioned before, sartorius, that thin strip across the quadricep. That's its two main duties, hip flexion and knee flexion, but it more plays a back role. So just remember that if you're asked specifically about the sartorius. But if you are asked about hip flexion, write the iliopsoas. If you are asked about knee flexion, write the biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. Okay, so moving across extension, as you can see, we're going to have the quadriceps. So primary muscles, rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, vastus intermedius. So let's take a look at these. Now, rectus femoris is right there. As you can imagine, on the lateral side, we have the vastus lateralis. Vastus intermedius, we can't see it underneath the rectus femoris, which is why I've just labelled the same muscle. And towards the midline, the vastus medialis are your quadriceps. Again, don't worry about labelling, but please remember they are the names of the four quadricep muscles. Sartorius, I've just labelled there, so as a reminder, if you look at the secondary muscle involvement on joint flexion, just to refresh that because we haven't seen it since the first slide. Okay, and we're finally there. So finishing up with the ankle joint, another hinge joint, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. But let's see which primary muscles we have. So start with dorsiflexion, tibialis anterior. Okay, there we have it. Tibialis anterior running alongside the tibia. That is the primary muscle responsible for dorsiflexion. On the other side is plantar flexion. We're going to have two primary muscles here. You can write any for the responsibility of gastrocnemius and soleus, but I think it's always best to just write both. Some go for tibialis anterior and gastrocnemius as the antagonistic pair. I'd get in the habit of writing both. Okay, they both play a big role in plantar flexion. So there's your gastrocnemius, and then the thin one going down the side is the soleus. So again, I've put in quite a lot of muscles there, but as always, you can pause at any point and go through this. I've tried to use a format where I bold if I think that's the main one you should write, or I've put it in blue if it's a pair. But to be honest, deepening your knowledge and understanding that they're involved in more movements is the best way to go, because when you take the exam, you'll be well prepared. Because just with thinking about horizontal adduction and things like this at the shoulder, and you get the pull-up action, but then you need to know that a pull-up's main muscles are the biceps and the latissimus dorsi, so you don't want to be writing pectoralis major. You want to remember that actually I know that latissimus dorsi is involved. But we're going to be going over that in a later video, and I'm going to, once I've introduced concentric, eccentric. But just about sometimes the confusions get made with this here. Movement type at joints, okay, and the muscles responsible. Because when we make it into an exercise training session, sometimes we forget the actual response, the muscle we're actually looking to train. For example, in a tricep dip, when you hold onto the bar, when you dip down and put the elbow into flexion, we naturally just go, oh, biceps, okay? But because it's called a tricep dip, it's going to be an eccentric contraction of the triceps and then extension concentric. But I'll try to clear that up in another video. But these are the muscles for simply the joint movements that we know. Okay, I hope it helped. Thank you.